So there are three things I want to cover today, and hopefully that's all that matters. So I'll say them up front. That way, if you leave now, you're good to go. One is the challenge we have with valuation models is less the valuation model itself, but our expectations of those valuation models and the data going into them. Even if we had perfect data, and we'll talk about that, I think our expectation for these models are a little unrealistic. Second challenge is the data going into the models is just flawed. It's missing, it's flawed, it's contradictory, and when we put that kind of data into a model and we expect it to have good results, we're really setting ourselves up for failure. And finally, the most important, this is a solvable problem. We're talking about standards, we're talking about collection, we were talking about machine learning imagery. This is a solvable problem, and the folks in this room should be helping to solve that problem. So just briefly about myself and the team, we've been working together for more than 20 years on multiple companies. Our passion is twofold. One is solving liquidity problems. So where there's a middleman, where there's some kind of friction in the market, that's something we're very passionate about and trying to solve that challenge. The second thing we're very passionate about is how do we collect massive amounts of information that's typically been either impossible to collect, or if you're able to collect it, it was a very manual and costly process. So throughout this presentation, you'll be hearing that kind of theme, how do we solve liquidity problems and how do we collect information that helps us solve that liquidity problem. So we believe that better data means better decisions. This should be pretty obvious. When we say better data, we think about efficient markets. And if we had perfect information, when I say efficient market, think Hayek, Fama French, these types of thoughts about efficient markets, we would have a really good baseline to start with. And the concept is pretty simple, right? If we have very perfect information about Apple, and I'm not trying to pretend that we have an efficient market when it comes to stocks, and probably from my experience in Knight Capital, we can probably argue that we're going backwards with high-frequency trading. But let's say we had, for a second, we had perfect information that the market was efficient. Then we could say we all agree about where Apple was yesterday. And that's great. We should have a very good baseline about where Apple was yesterday. However, we should have different opinions about where Apple's going tomorrow. And this probably is a good point to talk about what we expect from valuation models. So being able to push out a number, a z-estimate or a Redfin number, and saying your home is worth X, that's really great. But what does that X mean? It's about the same as pumping out a model which says Apple stock is worth X. That's great. But we'll have so many other factors that go into that market which will give us different answers temporarily. There's only one asset on the market today, and I want to buy a home. Will I overpay for that asset? Likely, if I can, because I want to live in that neighborhood and I'm willing to overpay because that's the only asset on the market right now. Is the valuation model wrong? No. But there are other factors that go into a valuation model that may be hard to capture at any given point. So I think the first key takeaway is that our expectation from valuation models is somewhat off. We should expect valuation models similar to an efficient market hypothesis to give us a baseline of what we can expect from returns or what we can expect from mortgage returns. In these types of relationships, but it's not going to give us an accurate prediction of what a home might sell at. For the same reason, the asset market valuation models don't give us good pricing estimates on where a stock might be tomorrow. It's a big problem. When we look at friction in the real estate or the residential market, which is an almost $30 trillion market, one of our largest asset classes, and we think about the amount of friction that exists in that market, it's just unacceptable. We wouldn't accept it in any other asset class, and the only reason we accept it in this asset class is we haven't found a way to solve that problem yet. As we find better ways to solve that problem, we're also going to have less tolerance for this type of issue. So we have, first of all, just a basic valuation problem. Valuations in the real estate market are not driven by arm-length buyer and seller offers. They're driven by middlemen the vast majority of the time. Folks here at NAR will know this number well. Just under 90% of assets traded in the residential market are broker-driven. So you have an agent in the middle setting a sale price. We have an agent in the middle setting a buy price. And we don't have an arm's-length transaction. What does that mean? That means that valuations are completely off. And it's not to say that agents don't know what they're doing. It's not to say that agents are malicious or erroneous. It's to say that we have a problem. When you expect somebody to look at 5, 6, 10 data points that they're not trained in analyzing and try and assume or infer from that number what the valuation might be, we're going to have big problems. And how do you measure it? It's very simple. Take a look at the initial offer price, take a look at the close price, and look at the gap. It's huge. In New York, that number is really great, especially as you go higher up in the asset class value, the 20, 30, $40 million properties. We often see homes that price at 50% above their actual closing price at the end. And one might argue that maybe they're looking to get a Godfather offer. That's true, but we also see when people have a real need to sell, how far down that price will go immediately. I mean, sometimes we see 50% off on a transaction. Look at the Plaza. That's a really good example. A famous hotel in New York off Fifth Avenue on the southeast corner of the park, of Central Park. Assets there are always on the market between $40 to $60 million, and they always trade between $20 to $30 million. It's an unacceptable valuation gap. Second challenge we have is obviously a broker fee. And again, maybe going into this market, a lot of us thought that agents don't do a lot for us. I'm sure the folks here at Redfin have different opinions on what the role of an agent should be in the transaction. But agents actually do a lot for us. And the more complex the market, the more the role of that agent becomes relevant. I'll put aside what we call the hug, making you feel comfortable that you're buying the most valuable asset that you'll ever buy in your life, right? 70% of home buyers, their first home, and the next group, 20%, it's not that they became multimillionaires, they sold their first home, they're buying the second home, right? So the vast majority of home buyers, they have no idea what they're doing. But besides the hug problem, there's there's an information gap, there's an information asymmetry problem. Did you fill out your 223A? These are questions that I want someone to answer for me, and I'm willing to pay people to answer that. Same as a lawyer or a doctor, accountant, you pick your service provider. And finally, real estate has very high transaction costs. How many people have decided not to sell their home at a given point just because of transaction costs? It gets really high. And in big markets, New York's a great example, that could be really high. A flip tax on the co-op could be 3%. Why? Because the co-op decided it's going to be 3%. There's nothing to justify it in any other way except that the co-op board decided it's going to be 3%. Add on top of that the taxes and the closing costs, it gets really expensive. So let's talk a little about the actual model problem. And maybe here's a good point to talk about our second problem. And now that we know that we're expecting bad things from our valuation model, now let's talk about the problem of information going into that valuation model. Data points are important. The problem with data points is they're segregated. What is the truth? New York, again, is another great example, but Boston's also a good example. What is the lot size? This should be a very simple answer. You go and measure, and there's an actual number. But if you go down to the Department of Finance or the Department of Buildings in New York, you'll have two separate answers of what the lot size is. Same thing if you went to Boston. What is a home? What is a vacant home? If you go to a lot, it says it's vacant, and there's a building there. Why? Is this an error? Partially, but it's also the way we record information. A lot of people here in the blockchain space are starting to think about how do we solve some of the authentication and authenticity of this type of information. But it's a cardinal problem. The base information coming from city registrars is contradictory. And when you have contradictory information from the source, all our information that we start layering on top of that, the MLS information, augmented information, collected information, sits on top of a base layer from the city that we have to assume is correct when we know it's incorrect. So we have public data all the way on the right there, or sorry, all the way on the left. And within that data, nothing talks to each other. Big problem. Second part is we have private data. So all these feeds that we tend to buy, investors, we'll look at CoStar, let's say, for commercial or some other folks. RLS is the feed coming from the REBNY board in New York, which is the real estate board of New York. Another stream of information, Comstack, which will collect different lease rolls, Credify, mortgage information. If you go to any one of these sources and look at the exact same data point, you'll get different answers. And these are the same folks that take the city information and information that they have internally. Analysts will go over this information and scour it. And at the end of the day, they come up with different answers about things that should be factual. These are not opinion-based. This isn't what's the quality of this asset. This is a simple question. How many bedrooms does this unit have? And finally, we have internal data. If you went to any large brokerage firm, any large MLS, any big development house, they have a team of analysts. And they spend a lot of money on collecting this information, curating it, adding information on their own about their clients, about their assets. And that information is also very valuable, arguably the most accurate information in the group here. None of them talk to each other internally, and none of these asset classes or none of these data points talk to each other across the board. So you have multiple data streams from different sources, official, non-official, and internal, and they contradict to each other. It's a great start, right? So at the end of the day, when we start thinking about what is the biggest challenge, what are the biggest challenges going into valuation models, the data points is that we have missing information, just information that we'd like to cover that's just not there for whatever reason. Second challenge is if we have the information, it's often contradictory. So we have two data points, and now we have to figure out how do we resolve these data points in real time, right? We don't have the time to go back and put our analyst team on every single data point. A user comes in, logs into a front-end portal, and wants to see how many bedrooms exist in this asset that he's looking to buy, right? That's the point where we need to resolve this information. We have 15 different sources, and they'll have different information about those sources, about that data point. It's going to be very challenging. And finally, the biggest challenge we have is the vast majority of information that we care about is not even being collected. And if for whatever reason it is being collected, it never makes it to the public eye. I'll give you a very small example, and again, this is a New York-driven example, but it's a very good one. A co-op on the Upper East Side may have never traded since electronic trading. It may be in the same family for the last 100 years, and it's never been traded. So it's never been seen on any electronic board. We have no idea that this unit even exists. We might be able to infer it from a building floor plan or from some type of offering plan, but for all intents and purposes, the unit doesn't exist, and we don't know anything about it. 100 brokers will pitch that unit over the next 2-3 years, and each one of them is collecting different data points on that unit, and they may be contradictory. And finally, when you look at those data points they collect, if that unit will ever make it to an MLS, the information on that MLS will not be the information that all these agents collected combined, or even one agent collected on his own. What if that board is discriminatory, and for whatever reason there are certain people that it won't let onto that board? Will that ever make it to an MLS? We know that's not going to be the case, right? Hopefully, at least. But that's information that an agent will know. Does that affect valuation? Of course that affects valuation, because a certain class of people can't buy a home in that building. And that means that that's going to affect the way we think about valuations. So the first problem we said is missing information. So this is an example, again, from New York. And you'll see a lot of data information in general. We talk a lot about New York, because we spend a lot of time there, and that's one of our biggest markets. But New York's also a big market in general. It's indicative of pretty much every large city that we've been in, on the East Coast for sure, but also on the West Coast. A through G are vendors. These are vendors that work with the Real Estate Board of New York and that provide data to all the large brokerage firms in the city. And the reason they're A through G is I don't want to pick on anyone specifically. Most of these folks are either clients of ours or partners of ours, so we want to be really nice to everyone there. But the challenge is real. If you look at the entire city of New York, there are more than 700,000 residential buildings. And we're talking about the building level, not even at the unit level, because it gets much worse at the unit level. The vast majority of vendors who work in a city have never seen these buildings before. So if you haven't seen a building ever, you clearly haven't seen units within that building. So your valuation is basically some kind of really small n, and you're trying to infer about the entire market. And you're saying, well, this might be representative. Well, it's not representative, obviously. And if you look at that 38,000 number for G, that's actually a different problem. I'm going to skip through a couple slides here. That's this problem, which is duplicate buildings. So it looks like that vendor, G, has really great coverage in the city. So good that it has more buildings than the city actually has in Manhattan, right? That can't be a good sign, obviously. This happens for multiple reasons. One of them is just standards. What is the definition of a building? It seems like an obvious answer, but it's not. A building might have 6 different entrances. It might be terraced and staggered. Where do we say that one building ends and another one begins? It's not a straightforward answer. And when you trust human input for most of your data points, you're going to have problems. So here you can see that very straightforward. There's almost an equal amount of buildings that exist more than once than exist once. And this is just buildings. If you looked at this analysis on unit, it gets much worse. So we said, first of all, we're missing information. We have contradictory information. And finally, information that's really important is just not being collected. Is the floor parquet or rug? How big are the windows? If I look out the window, what does that look like? Is it completely blocked? Is it partially blocked? Do I have a full park view? If it looked like that yesterday, will it look that way tomorrow as well? The city's in flux, in constant flux. The vast majority of the data points that we care about to make informed decisions for investing or for valuing a property are just not there. They're just not collected. And the reason they're not collected is because we trust human input for all of these different data points. So if I'm an agent, and I heard here about 12,500 different fields, and I'm sure none of them are relevant for every single specific market, but in big markets we see it. 500-600 is a very common number of data points that you could potentially collect on an asset. Expecting somebody to go in through a CRM system and typing in 500 or 600 data points is an unreasonable expectation. Expecting them to put 20, 30 data points is an unreasonable expectation. How do we know? Because they don't. We actually track these numbers. They put in 5, 10. They trust in the analyst department afterwards, and you'll see that in a second, to fill out some of the rest of that information. And by the time you're done, maybe you get to 20, 30, 50 data points on an asset when you could really collect 500 or 600. So the real challenge becomes, how do we collect these 5, 6, 1,000, 12,000 different data points in real time about assets that are constantly in flux, and they're not actually being traded on the market? Because if it's on the market, we all see it. But the vast majority of assets, as we know, are not on the market right now or may have never been on the market. How do we track all that information for everyone's benefit for assets that are not on the market? So this is a great example. And I call this the before, but it's very much the prevalent world in most places we see. You start off with some kind of agent input, a few data points. Some of them are wrong, some of them are missing, and we make an informed decision based on that, right? We think it's a 2-bedroom. That's what the agent wrote, it's a 2-bedroom. We think we know the address. We think we know the past history based on that address. And that's our world. But stage 2, whether that's an investment house or brokerage firm, typically there'll be a manual team or a compliance team, sometimes that's an automated compliance team, will do some information based on that. For example, in New York, we have to be an 8x8 to be a minimum bedroom size, right? So that analyst will take a look at that and say, well, you know what? That's not a legal bedroom. Now it's a 1-bedroom. Great. So imagine we never went through that process. We just changed completely the thought of what a valuation is. How many 1-bedrooms are there in the city? How many 2-bedrooms in a neighborhood? When we do these types of valuations, that's one of the biggest elements that we're looking at. How many bedrooms in cities, right? Square foot's another example. How do we measure square feet? Is it a gross number? Is it a net number? Do we include kitchen, bathroom? Do we include walls? If we don't have a standard on what is the number of square feet, we're never going to have a good answer across the board. And this is a very common problem. And if you try and resolve this type of issue manually, it gets really expensive. What do you do? So one option is what CoStar did. You put an army of 15,000 people dialing all day long. They call if they're commercial brokers in the room, I'm sure you've gotten this phone call. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, great. There's 15 calls a day. I saw you just leased, that place on 220 Riverside. How much did you get for it? Well, I'm not allowed to tell. Yeah, more than 1,000 square feet? Not allowed to tell. More than 1,200? Yeah, more than 1,200. Did you get 1,400 for it? No, not that much. Okay, so I write between 1,200 to 1,400. And you have people literally calling like that all day long. And it's no secret that everyone lies to CoStar, but you're laughing because you know it's true. So putting that same type of mechanism to try and solve the residential market is probably not a good idea. All we're going to do is encourage people to lie. And I would argue that within the residential space, there's more of an interest to lie because the broker's calling card really is their past transactions. And the more it looks like it was a really great number, the more likely they are to win another transaction. So there's a really strong incentive to kind of fib the numbers up a little. So there's clearly a problem that, putting people to work and calling. Another option is ComStack. ComStack, again, in the commercial space. You give us all of your information, and we'll give you access to everyone else's information. Well, what if I only have 2 assets? And that's all I have, and I want information about 10,000 assets. Well, I'm going to go invent another 5,000, 6,000 assets on my own to be able to get access to everyone else's information, because it's a reciprocal system. And even when I'm uploading that information, am I going to be really honest about the rent rolls I got? No, it's the exact same problem we have with CoStar. So while ComStack did a really great job in solving some of the automation of the CoStar problem, instead of having 12,000 agents, some of it's automated, we solved the authenticity problem and the authentication problem. We're going to talk a little here about how we solve this challenge. And there are a lot of ways to do it, but we think this is the best way to do it going forward. And we think this is a way that we would encourage other people to adopt as well. And we think that at the end of the day, this will give us a really good way to collect these data on these asset points or data points on assets that we don't have information about, and also encourage the community to be more forthcoming and share information. So you start with connecting the baseline. So if we can resolve in real time why 2 different data points within the city are incorrect and solve which one is correct, that's a good start. If we can connect all these private internal sources in real time to all these other sources, that's also a really great start. That will give us the baseline, being able to say where Apple was yesterday, right? Well, from here we'll go on and argue where it will be tomorrow, but this will give us the answer of where it was yesterday. And the way to resolve this problem is twofold. One is you have to work with the cities, and that's a really hard challenge. I'm sure some of you in the room know it. You have to work with the city to be open about the challenges they have and be willing to actually work with you to fix them. We worked in New York and in Boston and Philly, really deep within the information technology systems within the city to try and figure out what are the real challenges and how can we solve them for you without judging anyone, without telling anyone that they've been wrong for all these years, but saying, we understand the challenge, we want you to look great, what can we do to help you do that? And surprisingly, they really want to fix these problems. They really care about it. The people who sit in the information technology departments in the city, this is true in every city we've worked in, but especially in New York, they're very passionate about solving this problem. And they really want to. They're underfunded, they're understaffed, but they're really passionate about solving the problem. Why are they passionate about solving the problem? Because they deal with it internally every single day. So if you went to Department of Information Technology in New York City, they get requests every day from the different departments, fix this for us. We're coming out with a report tomorrow about lot sizes. We need you to resolve this problem. So they have to go solve this manually every single time. So actually solving this for them really saves them a lot of time and effort as well. So stage one is fixing the baseline, is going and working with the city to be able to create a layer that translates all this information within the city accurately in real time. The second is creating some type of translation system. And I heard here a few times people discussing how do we get people to adopt a standard, or how do we push people to be more compliant. It's a very hard challenge. It's an important one, but you can't really force anyone to do anything. But what you can do is add a layer in between and say, what do you call it? What do you call it? Great. We know how to take any information in and make it compliant. That's a good start. That way you can go to folks who don't have time, money, or the ability to be able to solve certain standard challenges and say, we can solve that for you. Give us your data. It will come out compliant. If you do that, you can actually answer some of these type of translation problems. You can take Nestio data. You can take a Credify stream and say, well, what do you call it? What do you call it? Great. This is what it means in both of them. That's a great start. Now we can start putting some business rules and saying, who do we trust more, and when, and why? And finally, internal data sources. Assuming those are the most accurate, and from our experience, the internal data sources are the most accurate, assuming they're recent, how do we put rules that say that we encourage the folks within the organization to upload information? And again, we know the manual problem, so we'll talk in a second about how we might be able to solve that in a way that's not manual. And then connect that everything to everything. So this is kind of a quick overview of our API system, and I'm not going to get too technical here, but what's most important is the sync API, which means we take everything from everywhere and sync it. So we take collected information, we'll talk about that in a second, that's up on top. We take public information, that's on the left, and we take private information, that's on the bottom right. And all this comes together and is synced in real time. And what we really say is, the ability to connect everything to everything in real time gives you the ability to answer some really good questions. So let's talk a little about how we might be able to collect data in a smart way. We believe that sharing information allows you to better, play on words for us, as sharing information is cherry-picking assets. But really what we're saying is, by sharing information, everybody wins. So 5 different agents pitched that asset on the Upper East Side, that co-op. So one wrote down the bedrooms and bath. Another wrote down the board conditions. Another wrote down what does the view look like. Different agents have different opinions, and they care about different things, and they collect the different data points. If we had a way to collect all those different data points into one data source, we're able to collect, instead of 5 data points per agent or 20, we can collect 100 or 200. So what do? We start with ingestion. We take all the data that comes from the public or private or internal sources, resolve that for uniqueness and completeness. That's a good baseline. And then we release productivity into the marketplace. Our productivity suite's embedded in some of the largest brokerage firms in the city. It does listing presentations, pricing analysis, communication with client, things that are not very fancy. They're really good tools. Again, I'm biased. But it's nothing very fancy. It's very similar to what you would expect from the large data-driven brokerage firms. Well, we use those tools as a mechanism for agents to share information. Every time you correct something on that platform, you went and talked about a client, you're uploading information, pictures on that asset. You're describing the building. You're correcting how many bedrooms and bath. If you have thousands of agents in real time pitching their clients, they serve as a check and balance to all of your information. So if 10 different agents corrected a data point from 2 bedrooms to 1 bedroom, it's probably a 1 bedroom. If 5 agents wrote it as 1,000 square feet and 5 other agents wrote 1,200 square feet, it's probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200. If you utilize the brokerage force, which are literally millions of agents running around the United States, to actually clean and curate that information for you, you're able to do some really great things. And that's what we did. We found very quickly that this works. We thought it would be really difficult to encourage agents to share information, especially in New York, where we started off, where there really isn't a technical MLS, where the Real Estate Board of New York acts as an MLS and it's de facto the MLS for New York, and clearly going forward it's going to be even stronger MLS. The reality is that We thought people didn't want to share information. We thought that was their advantage. I know something at Douglas Elliman that my competitor at Corcoran doesn't know. That means I can serve my client better, and I won't be encouraged to share that information. And that's true to a certain degree. But we also learned very quickly that agents are a lot more willing to share information than we thought. If you show them how much information they get in return by just sharing a little amount of information, their world changes. So if they knew nothing about an asset, and they have no way of researching that asset, and they go and pitch that asset to their client, they're very likely to lose that deal. I know nothing about that asset. I look like an idiot when I come up there. I'm talking about your asset. I know nothing about it. It's very hard to win a deal like that. But if all of a sudden I have access to a wealth of information from every other brokerage firm in the city, I know a lot about that asset. Maybe I don't know some of the proprietary information that other brokerage firm might know, but I went from zero to something. And all I had to do in return is be willing to reciprocate my information with the rest of the community. And we found out that per session, and this is where we are today, every agent augments 5 to 6 pieces of information. That means that every time an agent uses our platform, the thousands of agents a day in real time, add 5 to 6 data points every single session they log into. Some of these agents do 10, 15 sessions per day. Every time they go prepare a listing presentation for their client, a buy-side presentation, a CMA report, they're adding and augmenting information that we've never seen before. They're correcting information that we've seen and for whatever reason is incorrect. Going forward, that's just growing. And our job, not just at Cherry, but also I think the rest of the community, is to try and figure out how do we develop tools and instruments that encourage the community to be willing to share more information with us at the end of the day. And that's what we spend pretty much every single minute of our day doing, besides a lot of the data challenges that we have on the back end, but we've been talking about that a lot today. Only after we do all of that can we start talking about all this fancy information. Well, now we have 15,000 new images today that we didn't have yesterday. Great, we can start doing some machine learning analysis on is the view obstructed or not obstructed? Is the floor parquet or rug? And start filling out some of these non-textual or non-field type of descriptions. We mine description analysis. Agents write a lot of things in the description field. Some of it's incorrect. But there's a lot of really great information. For example, sometimes you'll see something. This is very true in big cities. In Boston, it's a great example. You have free access to the pool in the community center next door. So the building doesn't have a pool, and that's not a field that any of us thought about in part of the Reso standard, a pool within the community next door. But it's in the field. It's somewhere in that description. The agent thought it was important to tell somebody that they have access to a gym or to a pool next door. It's not attached to the asset. It's not attached to anything that's part of our standards, and therefore it just gets lost. But the ability to add a new field which says something like access to pool next door or access to gym next door is very valuable. And there are a lot of examples like that. When you start getting to subjective information, it gets really interesting. Triple mint, new, as new, updated kitchen. What do these things actually mean? They're very important data points. We might not put them into a field because they're not very scientific, but they're important to make informed decisions. So trying to figure out when an agent says it's new, what does new actually mean? What does triple mint actually mean? And by looking at what 15 or 20 different agents will think about a specific asset, we're able to collate that information and say, well, every single one of these agents says it's triple mint. I don't know what triple mint means, but I know that triple mint's better than old. And if all the agents say it's triple mint and it's not old, that gives us a really great data point. And these are the type of things that we can start collecting very quickly on that type of information. So where does that bring us at the end? We're back to this original screen that we showed. So on the far left, we see where the agent started with. Very few data points, unresolved, incorrect. In the middle, we went to where the analysts and the compliance team kind of added their information, augmented information, came to the second conclusion. But their conclusion was that it's not worth buying. Why is it not worth buying? It's a one-bedroom and it's overpriced. Because based on the information I had, it was just wrong still. And I decided not to buy the asset. That was the recommendation I made as an agent, or that was the decision I made as the investment team. Finally, if I actually see the truth of all this information collated from all these agents in real time, after fixing the baseline as well, you know what? It's actually more expensive than I thought, but it's still a good buy. And that's really the power of, at the end of the day, is we're able to say, even though it's more expensive than it was earlier, it's still a good buy. And that's the challenge we have with valuation models. This is New York more than a year ago. And as I mentioned, we thought it would take forever. We thought it would take about a year to be able to convince agents to be willing to share information. We thought it would take another 6 to 12 months to be able to collate that information in a way that makes sense. And we thought it would take much longer to actually be able to make that data actionable for buyers, investors, people in the community. I'm very happy to say that we were disillusioned in a positive way. In less than 120 days since we launched our collection tool, we had agents, hundreds of agents on the platform in real time adding information. And this should be a very encouraging story. It means that if you can do that in the hardest city in the world, where agents had the feeling that data is their advantage and keeping things to themselves was the de facto standard, if you can make the most hard-headed agents in the entire world be willing to share information in real time with everyone else, everything else becomes easier. And that's the truth. Every other market we went into has been easier than New York, and as we expected as well. But it should encourage everyone else out here as well, that there are really good ways to collect information. There are really good ways to encourage agents to share that information with the community. And if we all share information with the community, at the end of the day, we all win. We cover, in most of the cities we're in, we cover 100% of buildings and somewhere between 80 to 90% of units. And that's a really great number. It's by far bigger than some of the other players in the market. But there's still a big gap there. We want to cover 100% of everything. And the only way to get 100% of anything is to encourage the community to share that information with you. There's no other way to do it manually. It's just impossible. So I'd encourage everyone else to be thinking about how do we create platforms that allow everyone to share information? And to the standards point, how do we encourage systems to not have to be compliant with standards to be compliant with the standard? Instead of forcing people to change their data systems, instead of forcing people to change their schemas, how do we create a translation layer to take their existing schema and make it compliant? And I think at the end of the day, maybe that's a transitionary phase. Maybe at some point when they upgrade their systems or where they merge together with 3 other MLSs, they have to go through some kind of overhaul anyway. That's great. That's a good time to redo your schema to be compliant. But until such time, and there are a lot of MLSs in the United States or any other place in the world, how do we create that translation layer to make that as a stopgap between now and between the time they actually go through that upgrade? I think we all win. Thank you very much.